We're going to talk about our first, our main segment today, which is an op-ed in the Chicago Tribune. Do Chicagoans want to defund the police? It's a tale of two cities. Shocked by that. If that's what the poll told them, the poll is kind of useless. But it does have some interesting statistics in it. This was written by Kristen Mack, is the managing director of communications, and John Pelfrey is president of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Will Johnson is CEO of the Harris Poll, who did the polling. So let's look at some of these stats. You're going to be shocked, but 50% of the people polled agreed that gun violence is the city's biggest problem. Okay. Property taxes were the second most cited thing, even though then only 10% of residents selected it. That's right. Of the problems facing the city, taxes or property taxes are second highest, but they're really low compared to gun violence. It's an interesting finding. 96 of respondents say that gun violence must be reduced, and an unheard of agreement on that. And that's right. There's no doubt that is wildly high for a poll. About 75% believe that gun violence is worse in Chicago than in other major cities. Okay, turn that around. Whose fault is that? It is the media's fault. We did, either on Wednesday or Monday, we did a segment on a New York Times article that looked at how and why people are so bad at understanding crime trends. And they are very bad. The murder capital of the world, the murder capital of the United States, Chicago 7th. That is not something you hear in the Chicago media because they're not good at it. So that number is there because the media stinkies on the subject. Don't ever underestimate the degree to which politicians and the media will exploit this crime and violence for their own purposes. Residents identify background checks for all gun sales as the most likely to reduce gun violence, 63%, followed by higher penalties for gun-related crimes, 60%. Both, ladies and gentlemen, are wrong. Wrong. I'm all for background checks, and it will help a little bit, but it isn't going to stop massive gun violence in Chicago. It just isn't. Neither is higher penalties. The science shows it. That is just wildly wrong. They go to increased police presence in high-crime neighborhoods, 55%. Increased police community involvement in those areas, 51%. Both of those ain't going to work. Is not going to work. We have enough evidence of that. Chicago residents appreciate having police officers in the neighborhood, believing police reduce or prevent crime, 63% overall. It's not a complete zero. They're not completely wrong. There is some degree to which the police have an impact, but it's much less than people think. It's much less the police's fault when crime skyrockets and much less their responsibility for when crime goes down. Like, they have much less of an impact on it than people want to think. Make people feel safer where they live, 79%. That's actually, I shouldn't say that. That is probably true. People, large swaths of Chicago probably feel better, but do they actually make us safer? Strong majorities oppose reducing neighborhood police presence, 72% overall. Now, bad question. How about, do you favor funding alternative responses for mental health and drug addiction or drug issues where there's no violence, and having someone without a gun show up to those? That would have been the question. Notably, most respondents believe that both resident police relations and race relations in Chicago are no better or worse than in other major cities. That's probably true, although I think race relations here is a little worse. I think those are both probably a little worse here than most major other cities. 64%, and this is interesting, understand the disparate impact of policing, including 66% of Latino residents and 91% of black residents believe there is persistent racial bias in the city's policing practices. That should be a red flag for change. It won't be, because our mayor doesn't want change, and neither does the police department, and neither does white North Side Chicago and white Loop. White South Loop, white West Loop, white Fulton Market. They don't want any of that. 66% believe the police department lacks support among blacks, indigenous, and people of color residents. Are you shocked? No. I mean, it's good to have that number, but it's not, none of that is shocking. So just about two-thirds think there's a disparate impact on policing overall. 66%, two out of every 3 Latinos and 9 out of every 10 blacks. According to this poll, I'd have to look at more at the actual, how many people they polled in each of those race categories and where they lived in the city, but they believe there's persistent racial bias in the city. Not a shock. There is persistent racial bias. There just is. That should be a red flag to the police. It won't be. It won't be. There, to a large extent, the organization as a whole and their leadership for sure are incapable of learning. They're just seem completely incapable of learning, which is why we're going to go to the next slide. Next segment.